When the Ottomans won, the fighting did not end with silence, it ended with chains. The men who fought were killed or taken as slaves, but the greatest suffering was for their wives and daughters. For them, living was worse than dying. They were not seen as people anymore, but as property. This was not wild looting or random violence, it was a system, carefully planned and written into the empire's laws. Every woman captured became part of that system. Before we start, don't forget to subscribe, so you never miss these dark chapters of history. These women were given a name under Islamic law, sabaya, the spoils of war. The Ottomans applied this rule not with hesitation, but with chilling order. From the very moment a city fell, the machinery of enslavement came alive. Appointed officials entered the ruins, moving through the survivors like merchants through a market. With ruthless precision, families were torn apart, men separated from women, mothers pulled from children. To the empire, they were not people anymore, they were inventory. For the wives of fallen warriors, the horror began at once. Before they were even taken away, their bodies were inspected in public. Ottoman officers, joined by physicians, examined them head to toe. Their teeth were pried open, their skin touched, their fertility judged. Beauty, age, and strength determined their fate. A young woman with clear eyes and delicate features could be marked for Constantinople, destined for the palace markets. An older woman, or one judged less attractive, was condemned to labor or simply discarded into obscurity. Dignity held no place here. A noble woman who once commanded respect could now be prodded in the open street. Her value shouted aloud like cattle in an auction. The nightmare deepened on the road. Long lines of captives were chained together and forced to march for days, sometimes weeks. Starvation and exhaustion thinned their ranks. If a woman collapsed, she was left where she fell. Some were tossed into wagons, crammed together like sacks of grain, with barely room to breathe. To survive, the journey itself was already a test of endurance. And yet survival only meant entering another stage of humiliation. For what awaited them were not lawless dens of trade, but official institutions. The Ottoman slave markets were regulated, taxed, and recorded by the state itself. In cities such as Constantinople, Bursa, and Ankara, women were lined up before buyers. Strangers touched them, examined them, judged their worth. A woman's abilities were put on display, her skill in sewing, weaving, cooking, or music paraded like merchandise. If she failed to impress, she was beaten or her price lowered. The degradation was deliberate. Women were forced to smile, to appear obedient, to act as though they had accepted their fate. Behind them, scribes wrote every detail: age, origin, features, value. Each entry turned a human life into a line of ink in the empire's records. The most beautiful were not freed by their beauty, they were condemned by it. They were taken into the Ottoman harems. Later myths would describe the harem as a place of luxury and romance, but reality was far different. It was a prison disguised in silk. Behind the gilded gates of Topkapi Palace, thousands of women from across conquered lands were confined. Eunuch guards kept watch as they fought for survival in a world stripped of identity. A Christian girl from Greece or Hungary might awaken one morning with a new name, forbidden from her language, forced to follow rituals alien to her. Refusal meant punishment, beatings, starvation, or confinement in dark cells. The harem was not only a space of physical exploitation, it was psychological destruction. Women competed for scraps of favor, knowing that attention from a powerful man might offer protection. Rejection, however, brought violence or death. Many never adapted. Some descended into madness. Others ended their own lives rather than endure further. The harem was not a paradise, it was a graveyard for identity. For noble women, the humiliation cut deeper still. Wives of commanders and leaders were often forced into the service of the very men who had destroyed their families. Their degradation was intentional. It sent a message to every conquered land. If even your noble daughters can be broken, then no one is beyond reach. Resistance was always crushed. The system itself was built to enforce compliance. Imperial scribes recorded every transaction, every origin, every skill, reducing women to numbers and property. But the machinery of dehumanization did not end there. The women were also forced into producing the empire's future slaves. Any child born to an enslaved mother was not hers to keep. By law, that child belonged to the master. Mothers were made to raise children they knew could be taken from them at any moment. This was not chaos nor wild cruelty. It was systematic, organized, written into the bones of the empire, a bureaucracy of human misery, where survival itself was often worse than death. The womb itself became another battlefield. For captive women, even motherhood was twisted into a weapon of empire, and when that was not enough, faith itself was turned into a tool of domination. Christian women taken as spoils were forced into conversions that were not about belief, but about power. These were not ceremonies of faith, but rituals of control, refuse, and torture awaited. Accept. And the chain was sealed forever. Conversion severed more than religion. It erased identity. A woman who surrendered under threat was cut off from her family, her culture, her past. She could never return. To her community, she was lost. To her captors, she was remade. The Ottomans understood this well. By breaking a woman's ties to her old world, they ensured conquest became permanent. Armies won battles in days or weeks, but women lived under defeat for generations. Their bodies became extensions of the empire's power, their children born into bondage, their identities crushed beneath law and ritual. But this was only part of the cruelty. The Ottomans wanted more than private domination. They weaponized humiliation in public, turning women's suffering into a warning for every conquered people. Conversion rituals often mocked their old faith. Priests were absent, their gods insulted, their traditions ridiculed. Refusing to utter the Islamic creed brought whippings, starvation, or confinement in blackened cells. Accepting it meant the chains grew tighter. For a Christian wife, saying those words did not bring freedom. It sealed her as a Muslim slave, with no path back. Escape became meaningless. Her family would not take her, her church would reject her, her people would see her as erased. Conversion was a second death. The Ottomans perfected this cruelty because they understood destruction lasted longest when it was written into law and bloodlines. Enslaved women became instruments of reproduction. Every child born to them was not theirs, it belonged to the master. A boy might be trained as a servant, a soldier, or forced into the ranks of the Janissaries. A girl was destined to take her mother's place in the endless cycle of sale, humiliation, and confinement. Mothers raised children knowing they were raising the next generation of slaves. Their wombs were no longer their own. They were tools for empire. The scale of the system was revealed in the records. Imperial scribes catalogued everything: names, ages, prices, skills. These ledgers piled high in Ottoman archives, reducing human lives to paperwork. Horror became bureaucracy. Suffering became inventory. Every act was stamped, recorded, filed, proof that this was not random savagery, but a carefully designed machine of control. For the wives of powerful men, the punishment was harsher still. They were not hidden in markets or harems. They were displayed. Public humiliation was turned into spectacle, breaking not just the woman, but the pride of the community forced to watch. A noble woman who once held honor was paraded as a slave, a living message that no bloodline could resist Ottoman power. Resistance did exist, but it came at a terrible cost. Some women tried to bribe guards, others starved themselves, choosing death as their only act of freedom. Notes were smuggled, escapes attempted, but most ended in brutality. The empire thrived on examples. Every failed attempt was turned into a lesson, carved into memory. Resistance meant suffering, submission meant survival. The impact went far beyond individuals. Entire societies were reshaped by this system. Across the Balkans, Eastern Europe, and the Middle East, communities lost their daughters, wives, and mothers. Villages were gutted. Generations disappeared. Populations warped. This was demographic warfare, extermination by removal. The scars lasted centuries. Even survivors who somehow escaped or were freed never truly returned home. Many had forgotten their native tongues after years of forced assimilation. Others no longer remembered their prayers, their traditions. Some were rejected outright by their own families, who saw them as tainted. They became strangers among their people, living proof of what conquest had done. Historians once ignored these voices. They wrote of Ottoman victories, administration, and art. They praised tolerance and grandeur. But hidden in archives were receipts of misery, ledgers filled with women's names, prices, and origins. For centuries, these details were silenced, buried under myths of empire. Only in recent decades have scholars exposed the true scale, and with it, the most terrifying feature of all, its efficiency. This was not chaos, it was order. A system designed to endure generation after generation. Women were turned into units of value, their suffering sanctified by law, their humiliation legitimized by ritual. Bureaucracy replaced humanity, ledgers replaced lives. The Ottomans did not just enslave, they exported the model. Other Islamic states adopted their methods, from organized harems to regulated slave markets. The cruelty spread beyond their empire, becoming a template followed for centuries. What the Ottomans built was not only conquest of land, but conquest of identity. Cannons destroyed walls, but paperwork destroyed souls. One erased stone, the other erased memory. And in this system, no woman was safe, not the commoner, not the noble, not even the children born within palace walls. The empire's power was proven not only in its armies, but in its ability to erase entire generations. The battlefield ended in days. The suffering of women lasted lifetimes, but there was something more, something that twisted the system into an even darker shape. A cruelty that ensured the suffering of these women was not only physical, not only generational, but eternal in memory. Because the Ottomans didn't just take their bodies. They erased their very identities. Every woman captured was renamed. Every record stripped her of her homeland, her faith, her past, turning her into Ottoman property written in ink. But what if I told you that even this wasn't the worst fate? That some women endured punishments so calculated, so sadistic, that even the empire's own scribes hesitated to describe them in detail. The truth runs deeper still. Not all captives were sold to markets, not all parceled into harems, not all reduced to cooks, weavers, or concubines. Some were broken for spectacle. When a city resisted too long, when a commander defied the sultan, their wives became living warnings. Punishment began not in silence, but in public. Captured women were dragged through streets, shackled and beaten, displayed before their conquered people. Humiliation was not an accident, it was policy. A commander's wife might be stripped bare and paraded before the same soldiers who had slaughtered her family. Her body became a banner of defeat. Her pain, a performance meant to crush hope. Then came branding. Hot irons pressed into skin, searing symbols not to claim ownership but to destroy dignity. Others were forced into roles designed as mockery. Noble women, once seated beside rulers, reduced to scrubbing floors of Ottoman barracks. Wives of generals forced to pour wine for the officers who butchered their husbands. But humiliation was only the beginning. Some were placed in cages of iron, hung from city gates, left to starve in sight of their own communities. Death came slow, each hour a public sermon on the price of resistance. The cruelty went further for mothers of slain leaders. The empire feared bloodlines. It feared that a son might one day rise to claim his father's legacy. So the Ottomans cut at the root. Infants were torn away, sold or executed. Mothers forced to watch understood instantly resistance would not live, not even as memory. For some, torture became psychological. Officers devised cruelties that split the soul. A mother might be forced to choose between her children. One spared, one killed. Her heart shattered forever. Others were kept alive just long enough to witness the execution of every family member. Their suffering prolonged so it could be savored, and all of it was recorded. Every act, every punishment, written down by scribes as though tallying accounts. Horror turned into official proof of power. But cruelty did not stop at documentation. Some women were reshaped into weapons of conquest. A commander's widow might be sent back to her city under Ottoman control, forced to convince her own people to surrender. Her survival tied to her betrayal. To her community, she was no longer a leader's wife. She was a puppet of empire. There were experiments in degradation too. Some women starved deliberately, paraded with food dangling just beyond reach. Others forced into combat against one another, gladiator-like displays staged for soldiers' amusement. The empire wanted more than obedience. It demanded entertainment. Human suffering was turned into sport. Women who resisted conversion were dragged into mosques, beaten until they whispered the Shahada. Their broken voices recorded as victories of faith. Those who still defied faced slow executions. Their deaths stretched out into lessons for all who watched. Yet perhaps the most chilling fate was not death, not torture, but silence. Some women vanished into secret chambers, confined in total isolation. They did not live, they did not die. They were erased. Ghosts swallowed by the machinery of empire, their memory fading even among those who once loved them. The scars stretched beyond individuals. Communities never forgot. Villages that resisted carried the images, burned into memory. Wives of nobles mutilated, leaders' daughters paraded in chains, mothers forced to watch their children destroyed. The Ottomans understood perfectly. To break a people, it was not enough to topple walls or kill men.